Welcome to Genetics Decoded. I'm Sharon Palmer, your host. Please note that the information presented here is just general. It is not to be taken as medical advice. What we're going to cover today is vitamin D supplementation and the vitamin D pathway. From a clinical point of view, this is one of the most important pathways in your body. It is not a simple matter of thinking that you're taking a vitamin D supplement and you've solved your problem, or that you're going to go out into the sun and make some vitamin D. There are 6 critical steps in this pathway. You need to know what's happening for every single step. Your genetics will make that very clear, but if you can get this right, it will have broad implications around your health. Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at vitamin D supplementation, but more importantly, the genetics around the vitamin D pathway. I've just spent the last 6 months updating our vitamin D report that we use at a clinic level. I have reviewed over 200 papers in this pathway. The more research I do, the more I realise how critical this pathway is, how confusing and complicated it is. But I also know that if you're just taking a vitamin D supplement thinking that you have solved your problem, you may not be getting any clinical response at all. What you really need to do is go in and look at the 6 critical steps in this pathway and how they may be impacting on how your body is responding to vitamin D. But if you can get it right, every single tissue in your body has a vitamin D receptor. This is how important this pathway is. Let's look at the 6 critical steps. So we're going to start with step number 1. We know vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin. So people go, I'm going to go out in the sun, get a little bit of vitamin D. Your ability to make vitamin D from being in the sun varies from person to person. Genetically, some people will be in the sun and they will produce really good levels of vitamin D. Other people could be out for the same amount of time and may make very little vitamin D. What a lot of people don't realise is that the very starting point for vitamin D production in the body is the same starting point for cholesterol production. So what you have is you've got this kind of precursor hormone, and your body's got the ability to either shunt it down to produce cholesterol, or in response to you being in the sun and the UVB rays, it can lead to your vitamin D production. But genetically, some people take that precursor compound and what they do is they push it all through to their cholesterol pathway. It means that there's very little left over. So you go out in the sun, but if you don't have very much of this precursor hormone, you're not going to make very much vitamin D. What we know is that just being out in the sun does not mean that you're going to make good levels of vitamin D. If you go in and screen your genetics here, you can very quickly find out what is your capacity to produce vitamin D from being in the sun. You may think, well, if I can't make vitamin D from the sun, I'll just take a supplement. And that certainly, that would be one of the interventions that we would put into play for people with risk factors in step number 1. We would know that you may not have good blood levels because you can't make vitamin D from sun exposure. There's also not a lot of foods that are high in vitamin D. And then, of course, people can go through to supplementation. But what the research is showing is that the vitamin D that we produce from the sun may have slightly different activity than the vitamin D that we're getting from our food or from a supplement, particularly around the impact around bone health and the utilisation of calcium. The other thing is, especially here in Australia, we've all been told to stay out of the sun. And so we kind of slip, slop, slap. We put all of this sunscreen on. We've been told to stay out of the sun, particularly between 10 and 2. That is also the time of the day where you'll make the most vitamin D. So we're kind of in a little bit of a dilemma here. We know how important this vitamin D is, but we've been directed to stay away from exposing ourselves because of the risk of skin cancers. But one of the things you can do is simply by doing a blood test, you can go in and have a look at where your levels are. But if you have got genetic variances in step number 1, you may not make very good levels from being out in the sun. Then we've got step number 2. And step number 2 is the conversion of vitamin D into something called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. So when you go off and do your blood test, so your GP or your practitioner says, I want to know what your vitamin D levels are, what you're measuring is the 25-hydroxy in the blood. But that is inactive. It doesn't do anything in the blood. So let's say you go in the sun, you take a supplement, or maybe you've gone and got some wild caught salmon that will be high in vitamin D, and you think, that's it, I've got it in my body. But if your enzyme system that converts that into the 25-hydroxy form, if that is not working well, then you may not end up with very good blood levels in spite of all the things that you think you're doing right. For people who've got mutations in step number 2, it's very important to go in and do a blood test, but knowing that our response to supplementation, our response to getting vitamin D in the diet may be slow. And this is why it's important to continue to monitor to make sure that over time those levels begin to come up. Then we've got step number 3. And of all the different steps and stages in the vitamin D pathway, step number 3 is probably one of the most important, because this is around activating your vitamin D. Until you activate it, nothing happens. That vitamin D that you're supplementing with is not activated, doesn't do anything. The vitamin D you make from the sun, until you activate it, it doesn't do anything. And there's only one set of enzymes in the body that can activate your vitamin D. And genetically, for many people, these enzymes are working really, really slowly. So they're not good at taking that inactive 25-hydroxy form and converting it into the active form. And until it's activated, you will not get any clinical response from your vitamin D. Now, we know from the research that your kidneys are playing a really, really big role in activating your vitamin D. But more recent research is pointing to these activating enzymes in multiple tissues in the body. So the activating enzymes are at high concentrations in your immune cells. Particularly during COVID, we started to hear about vitamin D and about the importance of taking vitamin D supplementation. During COVID, it was very, very difficult to even get hold of vitamin D. So people started to make this connection between vitamin D and the immune system. But if you can't activate it, then you will not be able to drive your immune system in the way that you think. You will not be able to modulate your immune system in the way that you're hoping for. So again, you've got to know, because if you're really slow at activating your vitamin D, you need to focus your interventions on upregulating this pathway. And there's a number of interventions that you can do. It can be from a dietary point of view, from a lifestyle point of view, but your interventions around activating your vitamin D are going to be different than your interventions if you've got mutations in step 1 as opposed to step 2. By looking genetically and pinpointing where your problem lays, you can go in and effectively address this. We also know that these activating enzymes are at high quantities in our bone cells. So again, we hear a lot about vitamin D and the impact on bone health and the impact around risk of osteopenia and osteoporosis. But again, if your enzymes are not working quickly, you're not going to make good levels of this activated vitamin D. When we know that vitamin D is playing a role in every tissue in your body, it is the activated form, and you need to be able to activate it. Then we've got step number 4, and this is about inactivating the activated form. And your body likes to keep this really tight little balance between how much activated vitamin D you have and making sure that it doesn't get too high. So first of all, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. So you've got to be careful around dosing. You don't want to overdose. Too much of a good thing can be too much of a good thing. Vitamin D plays such a big role in the ability to absorb and utilize your calcium. And we know that if you take too much of it, it can lead to this hypercalcification through the body. So that could impact around your kidneys and also impact around the vascular system, in that you start to calcify your blood vessels, which from a cardiovascular point of view is the last thing you want to be doing. You've got to be really careful when you're supplementing that you're just not thinking that more is better. What we're also finding is that if you put a lot of vitamin D in all at once, your body will actually upregulate the inactivating enzymes to try and maintain that balance. Researchers are really questioning around, should we be doing this mega dosing? And you will see quite a lot of different protocols across different practitioners. You may get a practitioner who recommends 1,000 international units per day, which is a pretty standard dose. But I have seen patients where I say, are you taking vitamin D? And they go, yes. And I go, how much are you taking? And they go, 20,000 international units a day, not a week, but a day. There's a lot of self-prescribing. There's a lot of belief that I've just got to push my levels up. Otherwise, I'm not going to get the impact that I'm looking for. But researchers are going, we may not be achieving anything through this mega dosing. It may be better to be slow and steady over time. Now, in some people, the activity of those inactivating enzymes are really rapid. Now, that's not a great thing from a clinical point of view. If you're removing the activated form too quickly, you end up with the same problem with not enough activated vitamin D at the tissue level. This will be compounded if you also have risk factors in the ability to activate it. What I see in clinic, I see all different presentations. Quite frequently, what you see is patients who cannot activate their vitamin D. They're very slow at activating it, but at the same time, their inactivation system is working too quickly. And that means that their capacity to have enough at a tissue level is really, really poor. And this has nothing to do with what your levels may look like in the blood. You may have really good levels. You may have levels that people are telling you are too high. But until you know how the balance between the activation and the inactivation is happening at the tissue level, you really have no capacity to know what the body is doing here and what you need to do. We also see from the research that cancer cells tend to really upregulate the inactivation of vitamin D. And we know that one of the roles of vitamin D is around cell growth and cell proliferation. Your vitamin D pathway helps to keep that all in balance. And of course, with cancer, there's increased cell proliferation and cell growth. Your vitamin D pathway is really important to assess if you've had any cancer risk or there's family history of cancer as well. But your cancer cell has the ability to upregulate the clearance of this activated vitamin D, because what it knows is essentially that activated vitamin D is interfering with its function, so it wants to get rid of it. You can see where from a clinical point of view, there could be other factors that could lead to this inactivation, but if your own enzyme system is working too quickly, you will overclear that vitamin D. Then we're looking at step number 5. This is the ability to bind and transport your vitamin D. And you've got to literally pick up your vitamin D and put it on the receptor. And again, I keep coming back to we need to let go of this belief system that just because we eat something or take a supplement, that it's in the cell. It is so much more complicated than that. You always have these transport proteins. You always have receptors that are allowing these nutrients to get into the cell. And all of this is controlled from a genetic perspective. And that's what you can go in and look at now. You don't have to guess whether you're able to do those things. You can see. And if you're having a problem, then you've got to get the right intervention into play. And this is what we're seeing with the vitamin D pathway, is you've got to produce these binding proteins, you've got to transport it in the blood, and then you've got to put this vitamin D directly on the receptor itself. Now, again, some people have genetic variances in which they're not making good levels of this binding protein. It means that they're going to have a number of risk factors. There's not a lot of vitamin D that's free and available in your body. Most of your vitamin D will actually be bound up to these binding proteins. And this means that it acts as a reservoir in the body. So should you have a period where there's not much vitamin D coming into your body, maybe you don't go out into the sun at all, is that if there's not a lot coming in, all of that bound up vitamin D would be released from the binding protein and would allow you to not become deficient. Now, in people who are not making enough of the binding protein, is that they may not have a lot of leeway. So if suddenly their intake drops, they may become deficient quite quickly. And you have to look at historically, is particularly in population groups that live in places where sometimes the sun doesn't shine for 6 months of the year. Before we had vitamin D supplementation, how did that population group survive those long periods of time without any sun exposure? Part of it is by having these binding proteins acting as a reservoir. There was this ability to release and not become deficient. In people that don't make enough of this binding protein, it's very important to keep looking at, on a regular basis, daily, getting in some vitamin D rich foods or making sure that they're supplementing frequently. But if you can't get that vitamin D to the receptor, there's going to be some issues in how vitamin D works through the body. Then we've got step number 6, which is the vitamin D receptor. Every single tissue in your body has a vitamin D receptor. And of course, your body is smart. It doesn't put a vitamin D receptor on a tissue or a cell unless vitamin D is playing a role in its function. If every tissue has a vitamin D receptor, then vitamin D is playing a role in pretty much everything that happens in your body. Your vitamin D receptor is even more impressive than that. If you look at the human genome, recent research is showing that about 5 to 10% of the human genome directly has a vitamin D receptor. So your vitamin D receptor is directly impacting on thousands of genes through the body and controlling their function. There's almost nothing else that has that amount of impact. And that's why I was saying earlier that you need to go in and understand how this vitamin D pathway is working, because it really is impacting so widely through the body. Some of us have vitamin D receptors that are not working very well. You might put the activated vitamin D on the receptor, but the receptor does not trigger and work. It means that from an intervention point of view, you've really got to focus on getting the vitamin D receptor working. Taking vitamin D, the inactive form, it's not going to trigger your receptor. You've got to do quite specific things for that to happen. And again, those things around your vitamin D receptor, the interventions will be different than if you can't transport it, as opposed to whether you can't make it from the sun. So with the vitamin D receptor, you've got to kind of make sure that that receptor switches on. You also have to make sure that you've got enough activated vitamin D sitting on the receptor in the first place. So this is where I was saying that, if I look at those 6 critical steps in the vitamin D pathway, getting enough activated vitamin D made is really important, but then you've got to get it on the receptor and the receptor has to work. When I talk to patients clinically, most people have never even realised that they have a vitamin D receptor. They don't realise that there's inactive forms and activated forms. And so they may be taking their vitamin D, watching their blood levels come up, and then also wondering why some things might not be getting better in the body as well. What you want to do is really use your genetics to go in and screen around your vitamin D pathway. You need to look really carefully here. There's not a lot of companies doing a really good job around the vitamin D pathway. They might do 1 or 2 steps. It's not clear what those steps are. The genes around the vitamin D pathway are kind of all just grouped together. Nobody really knows what's happening. Do your homework here. Make sure that you get real clarity around that vitamin D receptor. Now, I have done my vitamin D pathway, and I'm going to use that as a little bit of an illustration here. For myself, my step number 1, I've only got 20% mutations in that pathway. What that means is that most of the genes are working the way that they should do, is that I've actually got good capacity if I go out into the sun to produce vitamin D. But my step number 2, which is allowing me to produce the 25-hydroxy form, the form that I would measure in my blood test, I have 100% mutation in that pathway. We screen about 5 or 6 different variants, and what that means is that I have a homozygous mutation in every single gene in that pathway. And so my capacity to produce 25-hydroxy is incredibly poor. And that's certainly reflected. I remember when I first did my blood test, my levels were not great at all. I also have a family member who has the honour of having the lowest vitamin D level I have ever seen. And again, because I'm picking up my genetics from my mum and dad, my siblings are picking up genetics from mum or dad, is that, if you have a problem, there's quite a good chance that other family members may be having an issue as well. Then step number 3 is around activating your vitamin D. Again, I have 100% mutation in that pathway. So of all the different variances we look at, again, I've got the double homozygous presentation. My ability to activate my vitamin D is really poor. And we're seeing from the research that not being able to activate the vitamin D may have real implications around an autoimmune perspective. And so again, if anyone's got any autoimmune disease or they've got a family history, then you really want to go in and look at this pathway. And I've got a very strong family history of autoimmune. I can trace things like vitiligo, which is where, when you see those white patches on the skin, that's actually autoimmune. The immune system is destroying the cells that produce your pigment. I've got it on my mother's side. We can trace it back 3 or 4 generations. And I always thought that it was just on my mum's side. But then one day, my father's in his 80s now, and he was having some health issues, and I hadn't seen him for a couple of weeks. And I went and visited, and I opened up the door, and he had all of these white patches all over his face. And I'm like, when did that happen? And he goes, they've just popped out. What I know is that was vitiligo. So I've got it on both sides of the family. And this also says to me too that when there's other aspects of your health, maybe there's something else going on and suddenly the immune system becomes compromised, this is where things can change quite rapidly. So we see his vitiligo come and go depending on how well he's doing. So when I see these white patches, I think, not as healthy as we want when they go. But you see other people with vitiligo and it's persistent, and you see it all over their body. Sometimes they get it on their face, on their hands. But the inability to activate your vitamin D is playing a role here. What I do is I really focus on the interventions around activating my vitamin D. There's a number of them, and they're across supplementation, they're across lifestyle choices. I just make sure that I'm really vigilant in putting those things into practice. Then we've got step number 4, which is inactivating your vitamin D. I have a double whammy here. I am very, very slow at activating. That's that 100%. And the activity of the enzymes that are clearing that activated vitamin D are working incredibly quickly. It means that my ability to have enough activated vitamin D at the tissue level is very poor. Now, clinically, sometimes I see people who can't activate it, but they're not over-clearing it, or I see vice versa. The main thing is to know what is your presentation so that you understand clinically how that could be impacting, but then more importantly, how do you go in and begin to make some changes to the activity of those enzymes? And then finally, we're looking at step number 6. I've got significant mutations in my vitamin D receptor function. So when I look at my summary of my vitamin D pathway, it is not a positive for me from a clinical point of view. I can see that it shows up in key risk factors through my family history, but I'm very, very proactive in going in and making sure I address that. And what I know is right now I don't have any autoimmune diseases, which is really, really good. If any of you are now interested in your vitamin D pathway, as I think you really should be, I would highly recommend that you do some genetic screening around this pathway. It will give you clear insight into each of those 6 steps, the clinical impact through the body, but more importantly, how do you go in and compensate and mitigate for those pathways or those steps not working? Because if you can get in and you can make some significant changes, its impact will be widespread through the whole body. Thank you so much for listening to Genetics Decoded. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Tell your friends all about what we're doing, because we truly are individuals. Your genetic data can be used for you to make much better decisions around your diet, supplements, and lifestyle. Join me each week to find out how.